The title of this video is Maybe It's Pleasure. The first philosopher we'll study is John Stuart Mill, who proposes that the highest ethical principle is actually about pleasure. But before we can understand what Mill is doing, in fact, before we can really read him and understand what he means, we need a little background. The theory that John Stuart Mill proposes, which puts pleasure right at the center of ethical life, is not new, even in the 19th century when he publishes it in the first text we're reading this term. No, very similar theories have been around since ancient Greek times. There was a philosopher, Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE, who claimed that the only life that is worth living is the one that seeks pleasure above all other goals. You can hear that our word Epicurean comes from Epicurus's name. And when you start to read your way into Mill's book, you'll see Epicurus and Epicureanism come up frequently. Mill's theory is one that is very ancient, but often discredited, and Mill wants to renew it and reassert it. Another word for this theory is hedonism, which comes from the Greek word hedon, which simply means pleasure. Now we need to be careful because we sometimes talk about hedonism as the pursuit of physical pleasure alone, and that's not what Epicurus preached. He thought that friendship, for example, was superior to any physical pleasures we could have. Even when it came to physical pleasures like food, alcohol, and sex, Epicurus taught that we should avoid them most of the time, so that when we do indulge in them, we can fully appreciate the pleasure we get from them. The important thing here is that Epicurus, Epicureanism, and hedonism all stand for the same thing in Mill's text, the idea that pleasure is the highest ethical value human beings can pursue. John Stuart Mill was not the first philosopher who tried to renew or revive hedonism in modern times. Before him, Jeremy Bentham tried it. Bentham, 1748 to 1832 in England, wrote that, quote, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people that is the highest criterion of right and wrong actions." This is Bentham's version of what came to be known as the greatest happiness principle, or GHP for short. It will help us to know that Bentham thought we could quantify happiness in a very simple, straightforward way. Happiness for him was all about pleasure and pain. He thought about pleasure as positive and pain as negative. For every pleasure, for Bentham, we can assign a positive number, depending on how long the pleasure lasts and how intense it is. For every pain, we can assign a negative number, again, depending on its duration and intensity. And to decide whether an action is right or wrong, we just have to observe or predict how much pleasure it will cause and how much pain it will induce, and then do the math. If pleasure minus pain results in a positive number, the action is right. If it's a negative number, the action is wrong. Let's try an example. I want to decide whether I should spend the afternoon watching Netflix or volunteering at a food bank. Well, how much pleasure would I get from watching Netflix? Let's say it will be intensely pleasurable for 2 hours, and it won't be painful at all, either for me or for anyone else. So I'll just approximate the quantity of pleasure at 14, where I'm the person who's getting all the pleasure. I don't have to worry about other people here because I'm not causing them any pain. I'm not affecting their happiness at all. Then the other option. It will give me a couple of hours worth of pleasure to volunteer at the food bank, but also some pain. It's definitely not as intensely pleasurable as Netflix, but let's say I do enjoy it, and so I'll give it a 9. But it's a small place, crowded, not as clean as I would like for it to be, and some of the people are unpleasant to be around, both clients and coworkers. The person who runs it is bossy and abrasive, and a few of the clients are upset when we run out of their favorite foods or the baby formula they need. So I have to subtract something because of this pain. Let's say there are 5 units of pain. So when I do, 9 minus 5 equals 4. Now 14 is definitely more than 4, so Netflix. But I missed something. The people who come to the food bank are hungry, which is intensely painful to them. It's probably also painful that they have to go and ask someone for free food. Let's say that one of the clients who's hungry and embarrassed is at -25, and getting some food takes them up to -20, an increase of 5 units of pleasure. They're still quite upset from the embarrassment and from the uncertainty about where food is going to come from next week. Since I'm not just taking my own happiness into account, but everyone's, I have to add that to my calculation. And let's say that in the 2 hours I'm there, I help feed 40 people. That's 200 units of pleasure, right? That's 200 units of pleasure that are caused by my action. So Bentham is onto a pretty good point here, that when I start looking at my actions in this way, it's easy to see how volunteering at the food bank is the better choice under his GHP, because the calculation turns out to be 9 minus 5 equals 4 plus 200 equals 204, right? 14 to 204, Netflix to food bank wins. That kind of thinking would help me step out of my selfishness and start paying attention to how my actions could promote greater happiness in the world. The kind of math that is derived from Bentham's way of thinking about ethics is called the utilitarian calculus. It's called the utilitarian calculus. The name is misleading because it's neither utilitarian nor calculus in our modern sense of these terms. What we mean by calculus is a very advanced form of math. But what Bentham means by the term is just a way of calculating how much happiness or unhappiness an action will bring. And what he means by useful, when he writes utilitarian, it's that he's writing specifically about actions being useful for producing pleasure. One more thing we need to note about Bentham's GHP is that it does not refer to one person's happiness alone. It is not asking me to consider whether one action will make me happy. Instead, it's asking me to predict whether an action will cause more happiness or unhappiness for everyone.